Hello, welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. I'm joined by Ash Sarkar. Ash, how are you feeling?
How am I feeling? Wow. I guess I'm feeling really disturbed by the images coming out of southern Lebanon, which I know sounds a bit worthy, but that was just what I was thinking about.
No, I mean, very much fair enough. I imagine many of our viewers will be feeling the same. We will be talking about that later in the show. And the first half, though, is going to be taken up by Labour Party conference. I will be speaking to Aaron Bastani live from Liverpool. Britain's new government has come under criticism from business leaders and a former Bank of England chief economist for spreading too much gloom about the British economy. So, at her first party conference speech as Chancellor, Rachel Reeves' task was to inject a dose of optimism. But in the first 5 minutes of her speech, she faced an interruption.
They paid the price for their incompetence, their dishonesty, and their rule breaking.
And we are still selling arms to Israel. I thought we were voting for change, Rachel. Climate breakdown is on our doorstep. And we are still
This is a changed Labour Party, a Labour Party that represents working people, not a party of protest.
So Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, they've both had a lot of practice sort of doing these very indignant, we don't care about protesters, we're a party for change. I mean, obviously, the person in the audience there actually was representing a large constituency of the British public who, at the last general election, actually caused Labour quite a lot of problems, by voting for the Greens, by voting for pro-Gaza candidates. And I can understand politically why they decide to sort of take that dismissive approach to someone interrupting their speech. At the same time, that was someone protesting about people dying in Gaza, tens of thousands of people being killed in what many people see as a genocidal war, and one which the UK government is funding. So there will be lots of people watching that thinking, that dismissiveness, that defiantness from Rachel Reeves wasn't necessarily something to brag about. Also, people noting that the fella sort of taken away there, manhandled a little bit by the security. Obviously, they're trying to take him away. That's their job. I know that Owen Jones just sort of tweeted pictures of the protesting gentleman, his wrists. Look, you can see significant marks of him being dragged away and on his neck as well. Talk about that later with Ash. Before that, though, when Rachel Reeves got back to her speech, she talked up the so-called £22 billion black hole in the nation's finances and defended the cut to the winter fuel allowance. But she also promised change.
Next month, I will deliver the first budget of this Labour government. The first Labour budget in 14 years. And because I know how much damage has been done in those 14 years, let me say one thing straight up. There will be no return to austerity.
So she said that there will be no return to austerity, might be, sound reassuring. Interestingly, she hasn't confirmed, she hasn't sort of pledged that there won't be real-term cuts to unprotected departments. So the protected departments, or the NHS, I think education, probably potentially defence. I mean, I know they want to increase defence spending. But then you've got all those other departments, transport, local government. These are ones which are unprotected and where, if their sort of current spending plans are to be believed, we actually do expect there to be real terms cuts. She was pushed about that on Radio 4 this morning by Nick Robinson. Her answer was, you've got to wait for the spending review. She's saying overall government spending will increase. That was going to be the case actually under Labour or the Tories because so much money needs to go to the NHS with our ageing population. But she hasn't confirmed that there won't be further real terms cuts in certain departments. And I think for most people that's going to be, the real meaning of saying no return to austerity is saying no more cuts. She's not guaranteeing there won't be more cuts to certain departments. So the proof will be in the pudding there. And back to the speech. If Reeves and Starmer had been accused of talking down Britain, this was Reeves's perhaps somewhat crude counter to that.
The British capacity for inventiveness, enterprise, and old-fashioned hard work has not gone away. So believe me when I say, my optimism for Britain burns brighter than ever. My ambition knows no limits. because I can see the prize on offer if we make the right choices now. Stability is the crucial foundation on which all of our ambitions will be built, the essential precondition for business to invest with confidence and for families to plan for the future. The Liz Truss experiment showed us that any plan for growth without stability leads to ruin. So we will make the choices necessary to secure our public finances and fix the foundations for lasting growth. Stability paired with reform will forge the conditions for businesses to invest and for consumers to spend with confidence. Growth is the challenge, and investment is the solution.
So she talked up investment there. Now, I mentioned sort of at the start of the show, the former chief economist at the Bank of England who'd said that the Labour Party had been too gloomy. He also said that Rachel Reeves was tying sort of the Treasury's hands behind their backs with her fiscal rule, which means that debt's not allowed to, or debt must be falling over a 5-year period, which means essentially that investment from the state is going to be very difficult. That means that the Labour Party is sort of begging private industry to invest in the economy. We do want private industry to invest in the economy, but you don't really want to be sort of begging them to do that from a position of weakness, which is the danger with this iteration of the Labour Party. Let's look at one last part of that speech, which was perhaps the meatiest statement of intent.
Growth requires stability, but not stability alone. It requires active government, and it requires the contribution of people in every part of Britain, not just a few. Where there are vested interests, outdated practices, or institutional barriers obstructing productive investment, we will confront them head on. Where active government is called for, this government will act. And conference, it is time that the Treasury moved on from just counting the costs of investment to recognising the benefits too. So we are calling time on the ideas of the past, calling time on the days when government stood back, left crucial sectors to fend for themselves and turned a blind eye to where things are made and who makes them. The era of trickle-down, trickle-out economics is over. And so I can announce that next month, alongside our Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, we will publish our plans for a new industrial strategy for Britain. A strategy for driving and shaping long-term growth in our manufacturing and service sectors. A strategy to unlock investment, create jobs and deliver prosperity. A strategy to help break down barriers to regional growth, speed ahead to net zero and clean power by 2030, and build prosperity on strong and secure foundations. Because when I said that this Labour Party is proudly pro-business and proudly pro-worker, I meant it. This mission for investment, for growth, for jobs is why in a few weeks' time, this government will be hosting a major international investment summit, bringing together hundreds of business leaders to send a simple message that after years of instability and uncertainty, Britain is open for business once again.
That was Rachel Reeves talking about industrial strategy, sort of echoes of Bidenomics. But again, unclear where the money's going to come from because of her self-imposed fiscal rules. And then at the end, if you can't spend money yourself, if you say we're so broke that we're actually pretty desperate, we can't do anything until we got more money, then you do have to go cap in hand to sort of business and say, I think it's good if international business invests in Britain, but you want to be in a position of strength so you can get them to do so on terms which benefit us. And I think sort of talking down the economy so much and sort of saying there's not much we can do is not necessarily helpful. Although she is talking to an industrial strategy there. Ash, is there anything coherent here? What did you make of Rachel Reeves' speech today?
I think the first thing is that when Rachel Reeves is saying there'll be no return to austerity, that's meant as a purely rhetorical gesture. What she means is, well, we're not going to use the word austerity, but there will still be budget cuts or savings that governmental departments are going to have to find. There was that sort of interesting period between, 2015-ish up until, 2020, when the government was like, okay, we're going to stop using the word austerity. We are just going to say departmental savings. It amounted to the same thing, which is that public services had less money year on year to provide the services that they were meant to do. And this obviously massively impacted local authorities in deprived areas. So the proof will be in the pudding when it comes to no more austerity. How much more money are those local authorities going to get? There was no provision for that within the Labour manifesto, so it would really have to be pulling a rabbit out of a hat for there to truly be no more austerity. So I'm skeptical of that one. The second thing is about industrial strategy. Now, something we have wanged on here at Novara for years and years now is the lack of industrial strategy in this country. And so there's a sense of um, if not relief, you're sort of like, okay, great, Labour government is considering it. There might be some interesting things coming down the line that Ed Miliband is going to do in terms of making energy more affordable, less dependent on international markets. Those are all good things. But the key point is the one that you made, Michael, which is if you're going cap in hand to international business for international investment, sure, you've got that problem of you're coming at it from a weak position, like you mentioned, because you've been telling all and sundry, oh, the UK's economy is so shit. So then when it's like, oh, we really need investment, the international investors will be like, okay, you're weak, you need it more than us, so on our terms. That's one thing. The second thing is, and this was a point that our colleague Aaron Bastani made on GB News not that long ago, which is an important audience to make this kind of point to, which is when you've got the likes of Rachel Reeves celebrating the fact that Amazon Web Services is opening up a new facility in this country. It's like, well, yes, that's a boost to the local economy in terms of job creation. That's all good. But because it's Amazon, an American based corporate giant, a lot of that money is just going straight back to the US. So, yes, there's money here being recirculated in the form of wages, but the fact it's an American company, a massive American company where huge portions of our own digital infrastructure are dependent on it. That's all value which is being generated here and is going back to the United States. So when you've got this strategy of going, okay, well, we're going to go really, really hard on attracting international investment because we want more growth. I mean, I'm not saying it's all bad, but it doesn't necessarily do a whole lot to keep money in this country benefiting this country compared to, British businesses and state-backed initiatives, in-sourced initiatives.
I saw after Aaron sort of made that point, someone on sort of Twitter saying, if we don't let Amazon do it, it just won't happen because we don't have the companies that can make that happen. I got no idea. I got no idea if we can build our own companies that do that. I'd be interested to know though. During Rachel Reeves' speech, the news dropped that the Royal College of Nursing have rejected the government's pay offer for nurses in England. That offer was 5.5%. Health Secretary Wes Streeting has said, quote, for the first time in a long time, nurses have got a government on their side. However, the RCN have said that members do not yet feel valued and they are looking for urgent action. This is going to be one of the big challenges for Rachel Reeves. So the initial things you heard from the Labour government was we are going to sort of sign deals with the unions. These strikes have been going on for too long. Let's see what they do when it comes to the nurses. I think the nurses are justifiably going to want more than 5.5% because many other industries are getting more than that. The private sector actually has been getting more than that. So I assume the government is not going to want a wave of nurses' strikes because also if they've sort of celebrated settling with the doctors and if you still have a dispute with another incredibly key sector of the workforce, then you could say that was all for nothing. In terms of facilitating investment, so what Reeves was talking about a lot in that speech, one policy that's got lots of experts excited is this. I'm sure it's going to get you excited as well. Planning Reform Working Paper, Brownfield Passport. This paper invites views on further action the government could take through the planning system to support the development of brownfield land in urban areas. Now, that might sound dull and technical, but there is an argument that planning passports could make a real difference to how easy it is to build homes and other infrastructure in Britain. One reason it's hard to build at the moment, according to the YIMBYs, so the people who say, yes, in my backyard, they're opposed to the NIMBYs, not in my backyard. They say that every new development, well, this is true, every new development does have to apply for planning permission individually, and local authorities get to decide if it can get built or not get built. So it's discretionary as a technical jargon. Planning passports could move us to something more like a zoning system, what they have in the United States and elsewhere. So long as a new building fits certain criteria, the presumption is it will be approved. So if you own a bit of land, you say, I want to build this, and it fits with all the rules, then you can build it. That you won't have sort of endless committee meetings. Starmer has told The Observer that this could be a game changer, especially in terms of getting more apartment blocks built in densely populated cities. Ash, I'm quite interested in this stuff. I do think that our cities need to be denser. I know that in this working paper, it's not yet a policy, it's a working paper. They sort of say that in Paris, in Barcelona, the whole city is double as dense as the most dense parts of London, which means that you've got, lots more people living in a square mile. All the buildings are 4 or 5 or 6 stories here. Lots of low rise, very spread out. Takes you a while to get anywhere, and we've got a housing shortage. What do you think about this? It's very much sort of like the Yimbys are inside number 10 in the Treasury and the Housing Department and getting everything they want, essentially.
I mean, I think when it comes to Labour's mooted planning regulation shake-up, yeah, it's very much on a YIMBY basis. I think I'm a bit like you, Michael, which is I'm a YIMBY with caveats. I'm a YIMBY in the sense that I just think build more fucking houses, all right? And like, look, there was a local brouhaha close to where I live because like sandwiched between like one residential street and the sort of, more of a main road were all these low rise bungalows. Now, these low rise bungalows were really, really, really poor quality. All right, really, really poor quality. And also, because it was sort of tucked between 2 alleyways, you also had a lot of what we shall euphemistically call antisocial behavior there. So they were getting knocked down, and there was going to be not a massive high rise tower block, but something which is more like 5, perhaps 6 stories, right? Nothing crazy. And you had all the people in the Victorian terraces where I live, like kicking up a fuss about it and being like, oh, it's going to be a concrete monstrosity. And I just alienated the neighborhood group chat by being like, yeah, fucking build it, man. Like, we need more housing. What you want about? So I'm a YIMBY in that sense, right? I do want more housing. I do want London to become denser where it can, particularly where you still have, these hangovers of 1950s and 60s bungalow building where it is just like really, really poor shit quality housing. So in that way, I'm very much a YIMBY. But here are my caveats. One, what is the tenure going to be like? Because basically, if you've built this housing and the what's being defined as affordable housing is still out of reach for most of the low income people who already live in the area, then it's not really affordable housing. What it is building as a means of intensifying gentrification. And there's some evidence because of the way in which affordable housing in London is still um, inaccessibly expensive to a lot of people, that so-called affordable housing actually has intensified gentrification rather than stopping it from happening or slowing it down. So that's the first thing. The second thing is what is the management of any affordable or social housing going to be like? One of the things that we saw with the Grenfell Tower disaster was that this shift towards what's called, social housing, and the shift away from a sort of direct council housing model is that you have these like really uh, deliberately opaque lines of accountability. So if you are a social tenant or if you are an affordable tenant or whatever, um, you will find it really hard to get any improvements to your block or your building, because ultimately you're less valuable. So those are things that I think would have to change as well. And I think maybe the last thing that I would say would ideally change in my view would be that you have this zoning, but you don't have it at the expense of um, social and convivial outdoor space very, very close to those blocks. Now, at the moment, you see this kind of building, in the new developments where you've got the, shiny flats, and then, underneath you've got a Asda Express or whatever, like, a kind of tiny shop. And I'm not talking about that because that is a bit soulless and it is a bit rubbish. When you're looking at the more densely populated cities of, Southern Europe, you've got shops and you've got cafes. They're very rarely chains, the ones which are so close to housing. And you also have outdoor space which is intended to be used by lots of people. It's not just sort of like one sad bench looking at a main road. The idea is that people use that kind of outdoor space and it's a way of enjoying these more densely populated areas. So there aren't just these, huge marooned islands of dense residential blocks. You also have services and social space nearby to make it pleasant to live. So those are all the caveats to my YIMBYism. Michael, do you have caveats or you just like build it? I don't care.
No, my caveats are basically your caveats. Let's have lots of buildings and then nice little squares, ping pong tables. You know, I just want to live in somewhere that's a bit more like Barcelona or Madrid, but where I speak the language, which has to be here. It's the first conference for Labour as a party of government in 14 years, and the mood in Liverpool might be celebratory among many delegates. But for the general public, it's a somewhat different picture. Labour hasn't even been in government for 3 months, and already polling by More in Common has found that 60% of voters reckon they will lose the next general election, and over half of those surveyed think Keir Starmer won't even be Prime Minister by then. Of course, we don't really need the general public to be political soothsayers, but this is significant because Starmer's personal approval ratings have tanked since Labour's loveless landslide victory in July. So on the eve of conference, opinion had him as more unpopular than Rishi Sunak, with a net approval rating of minus 26%. It's the first time the pollster has measured his disapproval to be over 50%. Perhaps this is why the Prime Minister has been noticeably absent from broadcast interviews around this conference. Normally, party leaders grasp the opportunity to be interviewed by broadcasters on the Sunday morning shows. Instead, Starmer sent out Angela Rayner and Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson. Now, all of those frontbenchers mentioned have been embroiled, along with Starmer, in the Giftgate row. We will talk more about that later. One key area of public discontent, though, is Labour's decision to strip most pensioners of their winter fuel allowance. The £300 winter fuel payment will be taken from all but the very poorest pensioners, and campaigners have warned that some elderly people will be forced to choose between eating and heating. And the unions aren't happy. Here's Unite's General Secretary Sharon Graham on Sky.
The priority that I'd like to hear from him is that he's going to reverse the decision on the winter fuel allowance. It's a cruel policy. He needs to reverse it. And I'd like him to say that he's made a misstep and to reverse that policy. I'd also like him to say that we're not going to take this country down austerity Mark II. People voted for change. They need to see change, and he needs to reverse the winter fuel allowance and let people have that £300 so they can put their heating on this winter.
The winter fuel payment was always destined to become a key conference talking point, but now organisers have been accused of trying to silence a vote on the cut. A conference motion co-sponsored by Unite and the Communication Workers Union calls on ministers to reverse the decision to remove the winter fuel allowance from nearly all pensioners. It was hoped that the vote would take place on the second day of conference, but it's been relegated to the very end, and when the CWU won't even be present to be able to vote. Here's Unite's Andy Green protesting that move.
This is simply an attempt to take out the debate on the winter fuel allowance. Today is Economy Day at conference, and we have a Chancellor speaking and a composited motion on the growth mission, which is scheduled for this morning. So it's more of a surprise and in fact an outrage to us that the composited motion from Unite and the CWU on an economy for the future is not listed on the agenda for today. It is disrespectful to our members and every single delegate here and conference itself who voted for the priorities ballot. We're asking for the CAC to go away and urgently resolve this issue this morning, colleagues. Please support.
That was not a relevant point of order.
Makes me nostalgic. I remember being at those conferences, when it was the Corbyn years, these really hotly contested debates. That's not a relevant point of order. I want more time to speak. If you're a political nerd, it's all fairly enjoyable in a way, a strange way. I suppose it's better when you watch 40 seconds of it than if you've been sitting there for 8 hours, probably. In response to the vote being moved to the conference's graveyard slot, so at the end when most people have gone home, Sharon Graham tweeted this: UK Labour leadership blocks Unite winter fuel conference motion. Right now, it is fair to say that the Labour leaders have tried to silence the voice of pensioners, workers and communities at party conference in this blatant manoeuvre to block debate on winter fuel cuts and the departure towards austerity Mark II. When this becomes widely known, there will be real anger among everyday people. Real anger. It's worth noting that even though number 10 looks braced for defeat on the winter fuel allowance, conference motions are non-binding and the government doesn't have to change its plans. So it is likely, and we think that motion opposing the winter fuel payment will pass, albeit towards the end of the conference when less people are there. But that doesn't mean the government are going to have to do it. Elsewhere today, Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner have spent the afternoon addressing 500 industry figures who've paid £3,000 per person to be at Labour's Business Day session. That's £1.5 million in one afternoon from the bosses. Very efficient work. I'm joined now by my colleague Aaron Bastani, who is talking to us from Labour conference in Liverpool. Aaron, what's the vibe? What's the mood? What can you tell us?
The vibe is really interesting. I mean, it's interesting in so much as I've had several delegates, members, people who aren't even necessarily on the left, come up to me and say to me, this feels exactly the same as last year. The tone and the content of political debate could have been 2023. The proposals, the blue sky thinking could have been 2023. And it feels as if we aren't actually in government. So it's a strange mood here. I was on a panel earlier on with a few new MPs, including Josh Simons, chaired by Emily Maitlis, and they were talking in quite long-term tones about, well, if we solve these major problems afflicting the British public, we can win back trust. It all sounds very impressive. But then in the context of the last week and all these various gates, all these various scandals, or as they called them, missteps, it sounds rather empty and platitudinous.
What's the vibe from the trade unions? I mean, I was listening to Radio 4 this morning, and Mick Whelan, sort of this idea of the winter fuel payment vote being moved to the end of conference, he was sounding quite conciliatory. As long as we get to vote for it, it's fine. Sharon Graham obviously saying that this is an outrage that it's got moved. She wants to have the vote. It was today, wasn't it, on the economy day, sort of the same day as Rachel Reeves' speech. Is this... is there a general, like a genuine, I suppose, not civil war, but is there sort of genuine infighting going on, or is this really quite superficial? Labour are a party that have just got into government. There's going to be some limit to the extent of internal conflict in a party in that situation.
Well, in terms of the trade unions, look, different people are getting different things. Various parts of the labour market are getting really good pay rises. Others have been offered pay rises, aren't taking them, like nurses. But the CWU and Unite have really gone all in on this as a political issue. I mean, the CWU in particular is quite extraordinary. There's a funeral, actually, of a friend of multiple members of the CWU National Executive Committee, as I understand it. They will not be here on Wednesday. Now, I'm not suggesting that's why the day was proposed, but they literally cannot be here for that vote. And it's very irregular, for that to be happening. Of course, Keir Starmer gives his speech tomorrow. We know now Keir Starmer's Labour has compressed these conferences. There's not much happening. And they generally finish business on the Tuesday. It used to really be the Wednesday. In terms of infighting, civil war, that's obviously over-egging the pudding. But Michael, many people here, members, delegates, MPs, councillors, are looking at the polls over the weekend and they're going, that is really something. On the one hand, Keir Starmer did win more MPs in July than Margaret Thatcher ever achieved. At the same time, Labour just got 1 in 5 eligible voters. I do think, however, over the weekend, that stat of Starmer polling lower than Rishi Sunak has worried a few people. Another one, too, 6 in 10 people no longer trust Keir Starmer. And I think if you're a newly elected MP and a marginal, you're probably quite worried. Not necessarily about the policy or even Keir Starmer, but certainly on the messaging and on the communications. Over the weekend, multiple members of the cabinet, frankly, looked ridiculous.
Briefly, what are you going to be looking out for over the next couple of days?
Well, actually, what really interests me, Michael, has already happened. There was an event earlier on today. I wasn't there. I've had people there who've then divulged the relevant information to me. But it was, in effect, what Labour's higher education policy is going to look like. Put simply, many universities in this country are going to go bust unless they get more money. That means Labour have to either increase tuition fees, introduce a graduate tax, or give them more taxpayer money. And the suspicion of a few people that I've spoken to is that we'll probably see some kind of graduate tax or even fees being increased. Even if that's just £1,000, it will be an extraordinary political moment for Keir Starmer, who won the Labour leadership on a bunch of promises, including opposition to tuition fees, increasing them. Alongside that, they're thinking of a potential fudge around immigration figures to not include people who will be coming here for reasons of education. You might think that's wise, you might think it's unwise, but the point is that's a technocratic fix to a very, very political and very divisive issue. You imagine those Tory reform voters, some, by the way, who may have voted Labour in July, looking at that and thinking, Keir Starmer is cooking the books, immigration figures aren't actually real, and at the back of all of that, like I say, a huge crisis in higher education, and Labour maybe increasing tuition fees. They'll be looking at this as a series of technocratic fixes, but the politics, the optics will be awful.
Aaron Bastani, thank you so much for joining us live from Liverpool. I can't imagine they're going to look at the polls and think, what should we do is raise tuition fees? But Aaron's exactly right in terms of the difficult choices they've got to make. In a way, we're kind of already paying a graduate tax, but it's just a graduate tax that you have to pay if you couldn't afford to pay your tuition fees up front. So I think I've got an undergrad loan, which I think I pay 3% marginal for that. Some people pay 6% now, and I've got a graduate loan, which I pay 6%. So I pay 9% marginal tax extra on top of my normal one. So 9p for every pound I earn to pay those back. I can't imagine that if they introduced graduate tax, it would be that high. And at the moment, you've got a lot of unfairness in the system, because if your parents can pay your fees up front, then you don't have to pay all that interest that the rest of us are accruing. At least 274 people have been killed and over 1,000 wounded in a wave of Israeli airstrikes against Lebanon. Lebanon's health minister has said those killed include 21 children. The intensification of bombings against what Israel say are Hezbollah targets comes following a week in which pagers and walkie-talkies were detonated across Lebanon, causing thousands of injuries and dozens of deaths. Hezbollah responded by sending a barrage of rockets into northern Israel. An Al Jazeera journalist gave this report on the airstrikes near the southern city of Tyre this morning.
There's a lot of panic. As you can see, people are leaving the area because there's been another Israeli airstrike. These airstrikes have been happening since the early hours of the morning, in fact, in recent days. And we are very, very close to the southern city of Tyre. That is a very densely populated city, some 25 kilometers from the border. The feeling here is that the Israeli military wants to drive people out of southern Lebanon, causing another crisis that could be used as leverage against Hezbollah. We're not able to reach the site of the strike. There's a lot of chaos here. They are worried that there's going to be another strike. There's panic and chaos. We are very close to one of the most densely populated cities in the south of the country. This conflict is moving beyond the border, and this conflict is becoming more intense.
It's interesting that the correspondent sort of saying the feeling is that Israel want to push people out of southern Lebanon to create a crisis and cause more and create more leverage, right? Which is exactly what they're doing in Gaza. This idea that sort of you're using the movement of people as a weapon that you can then use at a bargaining table. We've kicked out these hundreds of thousands of people. We might let them back if you do X, Y, Z for us. Benjamin Netanyahu has said the strikes in Lebanon are changing the balance of power on Israel's northern border. That's crucial to the Israeli government, who have set as a war aim the return of the 60,000 Israelis who were forced to flee their homes in the north because of sustained exchanges of fire between the IDF and Hezbollah. And today, Israeli spokesperson David Mencer claimed the Israelis were going to great lengths to avoid harming civilians.
The IDF have sent pleas to mobile phones in key areas of Lebanon to get residents to protect themselves and move. The IDF has broadcast messages on Lebanese radio pleading with locals to move out of where Hezbollah hide their rockets and armaments. The IDF has established a website for residents of southern Lebanon. Now, Hezbollah endangers the people of Lebanon. They use civilians as human shields to hide its weaponry and carry out attacks against Israel from within that country. Israel could not be clearer to Lebanese civilians. If you live next to properties or homes in which Hezbollah is hiding its rocket launchers and weaponry, you should evacuate immediately.
An Al Jazeera journalist reporting from Marjayun in southern Lebanon explained why those warnings from the Israeli spokesperson were ridiculous.
Not even Hezbollah units know where the other units' weapons are being kept. So Hezbollah is a very disciplined organization. But this wasn't just text messages. People have been getting phone calls. They've been getting phone calls on their mobile phones, on landlines. They've also, radio broadcasts have been hacked. And the warning is very, very stark. If you're inside or near a building used by Hezbollah to store weapons or combat equipment, you must evacuate the building and move away from it immediately. Anyone who is near Hezbollah elements or weapons is putting itself at risk. Well, most people don't know where those weapons are. They probably don't even know if they are anywhere near them. Also, you have to understand the power of these strikes. If they go into a civilian area, the blast radius is actually quite massive. So you may well get stuck, you may well be injured within that blast radius, and you're nowhere near a Hezbollah site.
It's just completely dystopian, isn't it? This idea, I mean, we saw a similar thing in Gaza, obviously, to a much greater degree, where Israel is saying, well, if you're near Hamas, you should flee. What's Hamas, right? Everything they bomb, they say is Hamas. Now they're in Hezbollah. If you're near Hezbollah caches of weapons, you should leave for your own good. Well, no one knows where they are, right? Which I suppose feeds back to the point made by the first Al Jazeera correspondent we showed you, who said people were suspecting that this is Israel trying to cause chaos. And I suppose if you tell people, if you're close to something that you'd have no idea where it is, then what can that do other than cause complete chaos? Because as that journalist said there, you've got no idea where Hezbollah store their weapons, right? He said even members of Hezbollah don't know where they store the weapons, because the whole point is an organization like that, there isn't just some sort of central document that everyone can go online and look where they are. By the way, that's not unique to Hezbollah. You also can't go on the British government website and find out where we keep all of our weapons. That's not how national security works. Of course, it's reporting like that, which means Israel is no fan of Al Jazeera. In May this year, the Israeli government banned the network from operating within Israel. And on Sunday, Israeli troops raided Al Jazeera's offices in the occupied West Bank.
Our Al Jazeera office in occupied West Bank has just been raided by the Israeli military in the last few minutes. They've handed over a letter, a note that's been given to our bureau chief, Walid al-Amri, and he's been reading it out live on air to our sister channel, Al Jazeera Arabic. Our Al Jazeera office in Ramallah, which is in the occupied West Bank. The bureau has been raided. Israeli troops have stormed the network office. They've also said that the staff members that are there overnight have to evacuate within 10 minutes. They've told them to take their personal belongings with them and to leave any equipment behind. Obviously, our cameras are still rolling. You can see we've got some live pictures there from the Al Jazeera office, from the bureau. They've received a military order that will shut down the bureau for 45 days.
Ash, is this as simple as, Al Jazeera do journalism, which is difficult for the Israelis, and so the Israelis are shutting down their offices, even in territory which is, not part of Israel, right? Everyone in the world recognizes the West Bank as illegally occupied, I suppose, other than a few sort of people who believe in a greater Israel, like sort of the extremist Zionists. Should we just interpret that as this is just them punishing an outlet for doing critical journalism?
Well, look, if it walks like a duck and it sounds like a duck and it looks like a duck, you may have to consider the possibility that what you have is a duck on your hands. So when you have a military storming a civilian journalistic office, and they are masked up and they are heavily armed and they're stomping through with their jackboots, you may have to consider that what you are looking at is an increasingly authoritarian, anti-democratic, and even fascistic government in Israel. I would almost like to know what it would be like to be one of Israel's advocates in the West. Who always goes on about how Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East, looking at that footage and coming up with justifications for it. I would just like to live inside their heads and know what that's like. I was just looking at a letter from Human Rights Watch appealing to the UN to investigate an airstrike carried out by Israel last October 2023 in southern Lebanon, which killed multiple journalists, saying you should investigate this as a war crime. Now, that might be something that people have forgotten, because in the intervening nearly 12 months now, you've had dozens more journalists being killed. Journalists have alleged that they've been deliberately targeted in Gaza. that the IDF are well aware of where journalists are, as well as where humanitarian aid convoys are, and yet they've been subject to shooting and bombing. Journalists have been killed, and the IDF have said, oh, well, they were Hamas. Oh, no, wait, they were traveling in a Hamas car. The killing of Shireen Abu Akleh in the West Bank, now this obviously precedes this genocidal war in Gaza. Initially, the IDF lied through their teeth about the circumstances in which she was killed. And we've just about got to the point of, oh, well, maybe it was an Israeli bullet, but, we don't really know the circumstances. I mean, we do know the circumstances, which is that Israel has been allowed to behave with utter impunity. The reason why they've been allowed to behave with impunity is because America, despite all its public finger wagging and saying, oh, no, you really mustn't do this, Israel. Oh, Israel, you really mustn't escalate by invading Lebanon. Ultimately, they know that the US will back them no matter what, that if need be, if there is regional escalation, the US will move more troops into the region. The US doesn't really care, even when its own citizens are being killed by Israel, because a lot of the time, they're Muslim. So are they really American anyway? And if they're making journalism which is critical of Israel, well, it's more in America's interest for Israel to exist armed to the teeth and be friendly to America than it is for American citizens abroad to be safe when doing their jobs. Those are the kinds of calculations which are being made. And this is going to upset some people. And I imagine that there is going to be a pro-Israel clipping operation enforced. And I really don't mind if they clip this bit. I think that you could plausibly compare the attitude towards the press between Israel and Russia. Russia locks up dissident journalists. Russia puts the journalists that they're in fear of the state, whether they are Russian journalists or whether they are for foreign outlets. Israel bombs journalists. Israel shoots journalists. Israel has bombed journalistic offices before in Gaza, and now they're shutting down the Al Jazeera office in Ramallah. And I think that you are right to suggest that this is simply because Al Jazeera does difficult journalism for the Israeli state, and they're emboldened. They're utterly emboldened at the moment. They have crossed every red line drawn by Hezbollah, drawn by Iran, and also drawn by the United States of America, and they've done so with utter impunity. That's why they're swaggering about in the way that they are. I mean, it's truly intended to be a victory lap, and I think in some ways, when you compare the death toll of journalists, you might even have to say that Netanyahu is worse than Putin when it comes to journalistic freedoms. I mean, I don't think that that's an unreasonable thing to suggest.
Labour conference has so far been overshadowed by Giftgate, and figures including Keir Starmer, Angela Rayner and Rachel Reeves have all found themselves in the spotlight for accepting luxurious freebies, such as designer clothes, glasses, accommodation, gig tickets and a box at the football. Here was Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson yesterday on the defensive.
You are in a privileged position as a Member of Parliament. You will sometimes be offered the opportunity to go to events such as Wimbledon. I was invited as Education Secretary. Shadow ministers are often given similar invitations, and government ministers are often given such invitations. It was declared. I appreciate it is a privilege to be there, but I was very much there in my role as Education Secretary.
What about Taylor Swift?
Look, I'll be honest, it was a hard one to turn down. I appreciate there was big demand for the tickets. It was a privilege to be there. One of my children, was keen to go along. It's hard to say no if you're offered tickets in those circumstances, but it was declared. I've been clear about that, but I do recognise that, I'm in a fortunate position to be able to receive it.
I like the idea of being at Wimbledon in your role as Education Secretary. I mean, what are you going to do? I'm going to shut. I don't know any fucking modern tennis players. You're not going to be talking education policy with Roger Federer, but I mean, he's probably retired for a very long time. Although I suppose actually that means he's more likely to be in the stands, so maybe it works. I suppose I kind of see where she's coming from with the kid and the Taylor Swift. She'll say, obviously, it's a busy job. Maybe she doesn't see her kid as much as she wants. If she's offered a Taylor Swift ticket, the kid really wants to go. Maybe they have a nice day out. But I don't think it's going to sound particularly impressive to most people, especially when you're in a government that's telling people how hard and miserable everything has to be. Right? I think people might be a little bit more relaxed about this if they hadn't been telling everyone that you can't have your winter fuel payment. Phillipson there tried to shake it off. But while her Taylor Swift tickets were gifted by the Football Association, another name has popped up again and again during this row. It's the extremely generous Labour peer and mega donor, Lord Ali. Now, he's responsible for Starmer's smart new specs and designer clothing for Starmer's wife, Rachel Reeves, and Angela Rayner. So he's been buying lots of clothes for lots of people. He did found ASOS. He also kindly paid for Bridget Phillipson's birthday bash.
Your declaration showed that you received £14,000 from the Labour donor Lord Ali last year. What for exactly?
Yep. So I received that money from Wahid Ali, who's a long-standing Labour peer. It was used to fund 2 events, all of which was declared properly and thoroughly. That's why that information is in the public domain. The first event was ahead of my birthday, so I was turning 40. I thought it was a good opportunity to get people together in a professional context. So it was journalists, trade unionists, education people, MPs and shadow cabinet. The second event was an event that I held also again for lobby journalists, for people in the education world, as part of a reception. That's, you know, it was in a work context, you know.
That's a very nice thing, but if a Tory had done that 2 years ago, I know exactly what you'd be saying to me this morning. They should pay for their own birthday parties.
Look, this was in a work context. I didn't even invite my own...
You just said the same thing.
Yeah,
Come
look,
on.
I didn't even... My own family didn't come to that. It was in a work context. I celebrated my actual 40th birthday with my family. We went for a pizza. I celebrated with my kids. This was where I got together colleagues, journalists actually, trade unionists, education people. It was in a very different kind of context. Wahid is a Labour peer. He's been a Labour peer for over 25 years. This is fully transparent, honestly.
It's an expensive birthday party, right? £14,000. And I see what she's saying. Her family weren't there. Her friends weren't there. It sounds like it was a work party. Now, I suppose you might wonder whether these sort of parties that regularly happen between politicians and journalists and all the booze is paid for, is that sort of a sign of good government? I'm not really sure. Maybe that's a different conversation. What seems weirder with this one? So when it comes to Taylor Swift tickets and Wimbledon tickets, I think it's a bad look, but it doesn't seem to me obviously corrupt, because you know, it's if you've got a big event, it's sort of you want the government there. The government want to be there. You know, Wimbledon, for example, is this big national occasion, right? When you look to when it's the World Cup final, when you look to that box and there's the Prime Minister there and King Charles, those guys didn't go on Ticketmaster and buy their ticket, and it probably wouldn't make much sense to make them do that, right? So I think this idea that the organisation wants a politician there, the politician wants to go to be seen there, that seems to me to be fine. I can't really imagine that significantly changing government policy when it comes to the Premier League or Wimbledon or whoever. The fact that you've got this guy, Lord Ali, paying for so much stuff and basically being the sugar daddy of the Labour Party, that to me seems like there's a much bigger conflict of interest, because that's not just sort of this mutually beneficial thing where everyone knows what's going on when you want a politician to come to your event. You want them to come so you can show that this is a significant national event. The politician wants to be there to show that this is a significant national event, or because their kid wants to go see Taylor Swift. Doesn't strike me as the biggest conflict of interest. The Lord Ali stuff does. Not, of course, making any personal allegations against him, but the look is not good, and the potential for the conflict of interest is absolutely huge. And Lord Ali's name has come up again and again in connection to Starmer's Chief of Staff, Sue Gray.
What I would say about Lord Ali is that he's been a Labour peer for, I think, over 25 years.
Yes.
Donates to the Labour Party, to Labour politicians, because he wants a Labour government.
But he got a temporary Downing Street pass. From Sue Gray, we hear today, Labour Party have been very reluctant to say who sanctioned this pass. It was Sue Gray. That happened after he donated £10,000 to Leon Conlon's campaign. Leon Conlon is now the MP for Beckenham and Penge. He's also Sue Gray's son. There's something quite murky about that. I think if that arrangement had happened under a Tory government, ministers like you would be on the airwaves having a real go at the opposition about that.
I think you've got a Labour peer, a very, very long-standing Labour peer, who donates to Labour politicians, Labour candidates.
He donated to 2 campaigns, and one of them was Conlon's. No, he's Sue Gray's. In the election campaign, as far as just for the election campaign, he gives money to Sue Gray's son, and the next thing we know, he gets a Downing Street pass. You have to admit, that looks a bit dodgy.
He's donated to lots of Labour candidates and politicians.
Why does he need a Downing Street pass?
As I understand it, he no longer has a Downing Street pass.
Why did he have one?
I genuinely don't know the circumstances of that.
Farmers' wardrobes, or
come on. No, I think the reason that he donates to Labour politicians is because he wanted to secure a Labour government. That's what he's done over 2 decades.
All right.
He wanted to secure a Labour government, and he's got a pass to go into number 10. And he's been donating loads of money to various politicians, including the Chief of Staff's son, to get elected. Right? That does sound dodgy, right? Whether or not this is a guy who all he wants is a Labour government and them to implement policy, which is, maybe he is just this incredibly brilliant guy who needs a pass to number 10 so that he can sort of influence policy for it to be all the better. The idea that you wouldn't see a big red flashing light here, I think is quite stupid, right? You've got this guy who's buying you these clothes, he's getting you these holidays, and now you've given him a pass even though he doesn't have a particular role. And the uncomfortable questions continued with Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner, who was forced to defend using a $2.5 million penthouse in New York belonging to Lord Ali on a holiday. Rayner has denied breaking the rules over not declaring that former MP Sam Tarry stayed in a Manhattan apartment in December last year with her, saying that it was a private holiday and Tarry did not travel with her but met her in New York. However, it doesn't appear the nitty-gritty of what was declared and which rules were followed is cutting much ice with the public.
Clive, who was a Labour Party member, said, "I find it deeply disappointing that Labour seems no different from the Tories when it comes to freebies. Are we expected to believe that the donors get nothing in return? Lord Ali gave you individually more than £20,000. What did you promise or give him in return?"
I promised nothing and gave him nothing in return. What the donors and that have helped me in the past have done is seen someone that's come from a very working class background. And as you said before, I say it how it is. And I've always tried to fight for people. And since having the honour and privilege of being the Deputy Prime Minister and the Secretary of State in Housing, I've got a significant number of bills in the King's Speech because I want to improve people's housing. I want to get on with the job of supporting people.
And we'll
however,
come to these important policies.
Feature of our politics at the moment is for me to stand as the deputy leader, and you've seen the leadership contest at the moment in the Conservative Party. They will be getting donations to enable them to continue that work. That is a feature at the moment of our politics. That's why transparency is really important.
It's okay because the Tories do it too. Let's not forget that in opposition, Angela Rayner was leading the charge against Boris Johnson's £840 per roll wallpaper. Peter Carl, Minister for Science, Innovation and Technology, also denied that donations get you anywhere with Labour.
You received a £50,000 donation from Simon Ruddick. What did that buy?
It didn't buy anything.
Right.
This is somebody who supported me long before I was in politics and the charitable work I did in the past. He is somebody that set a business up in our country, created jobs and wealth in our country, pays every bit of his tax in this country, and he wants to see a Labour government, and he wants to see me succeed.
What's going on? Where did they find it? This is some guy who supported me before I went into politics. I mean, he said charity work, but he's got these sugar daddies everywhere. £50,000 buys nothing, apparently. Doesn't sound like money particularly well spent. Now, across the front bench, the government is very busy tying itself in knots justifying accepting luxury gifts and freebies. The Sunday Times reported this. Jonathan Reynolds, the business secretary, made the extraordinary statement that it was part of Starmer's job to accept gifts since people wanted to talk to decision formers, tantamount to an admission of gifts for access. I mean, it's his job to talk to people who might be able to make policy more effective. Right, so it's his job to speak to people. He should be speaking to business leaders, right? Because he wants to make policy which makes it easier for people to invest. Obviously, you should speak to business leaders, right? He should be speaking to trade union leaders. He should be speaking to all sorts of different people. But it's a bit strange to say it's his job to speak to people. Oh, and by the way, if they want to speak to him, they have to give him a gift. Right? That's not how good government works. Rachel Reeves, on the morning of her big speech, also had a unique way of turning or trying to turn a negative into a positive.
The fact that Labour received more donations than we ever have in our past, I think reflects the support from people right across the scale, from small donations from our members and supporters, from big donations from people who have been very successful in life. We appreciate those donations. It helps us to do our job of getting elected and making the change that our country desperately needs.
Ash, all this talk about donations, it's a bit of a gift to the Tories, no?
Whoa, was that a pun there, Michael?
It was.
Absolutely outrageous.
I can't get them off the
stuff.
top of my head, so they have to be written in advance for me. I know you can sort of you've always got a pun at the end of your fingertips. It has to be pre-planned when it comes to my ones.
Oh, look, I think you're being very negative about a positive thing. In fact, you could say you're looking a gift horse in the mouth. I just wanted to read you a headline, and this is from a Novara Media piece written by Adam Ramsey, and it says this. Jonathan Reynolds and 2 senior staff went to Glastonbury as guests of YouTube. Until then, Labour was promising to increase the digital service tax from 2% to 10%. Literally the day after the festival, it emerged that Reynolds had ditched the policy. Now, I'm not suggesting that YouTube stumping up for tickets to Glastonbury for Jonathan Reynolds and 2 of his staff was all that went into the decision to ditch the digital services tax that was planned, or to significantly alter the plan. But it's a terrible look, wouldn't you say? And this is where I disagree with you a bit, Michael, which is when you're living high on the hog at someone else's expense, whether it's designer specs or a nice dress for your wife or tickets to Taylor Swift that you just wouldn't want to stump out for by yourself, even if you could afford it. And all these things are being paid for by corporations. I do think that it creates a system of incentives which you may not even be fully conscious of, which makes you not want to alienate those people. And I think when you compare the treatment and the hounding of Jeremy Corbyn, who only took one freebie, and that was to Glastonbury, where he addressed the crowd from the pyramid stage, when he was sort of seen as nothing less than, Satan made flesh and walking amongst us, I think that it shows that there is something quite grubby about this whole thing, which is if you're a politician who says, look, you can't buy me, you're monstered in the press. Whereas when you're a politician who is doing the selfies at the Taylor Swift gig from, your free tickets, or you're hosting a drinks reception for your birthday with all the other journos and that's been paid for by a Labour donor, or, you go to, Glasgow, or you go to Wimbledon, or you go to see Arsenal, that's when the establishment knows that you're willing to play ball. All right, you're not really going to gun for people's interests too much, and I think that is embarrassing for how little our politicians can be sold. Angela Rayner, really laying it on thick with like, oh, I'm from a working class background, and I tell it how it is, and whisper it. That's why I had to have the free holiday and the £2.5 million penthouse in Manhattan. I mean, it's insulting to everybody's intelligence. If they're just gone, you know what, it's nice to have nice things. I work hard, and this is a way of doing it without having to dip into my own pocket or the taxpayers. I'd be like, you know what, venal, materialistic, shallow, but at least it's honest. But all this stuff, whether it's, oh, I was at Wimbledon in my capacity as education secretary, or like, I'm a working class woman and that's why I want the free penthouse holiday. Don't pretend that there's nothing in return, because while you may not have made specific promises, right? I can believe that politicians don't make specific promises. The point of being so close to politicians, that you're decking out their wives in designer garms, or you're covering their accommodation costs while on holiday, that means you do have their ear. It does mean that you are someone who's taken seriously, and when it's time to call in a favor, and there will always be a time, when you want to call in a favor, you'll probably have a sensitive and empathetic ear, a sympathetic ear to that favor. You'll be heard. And then that's influence, right? That's influence, right? It might fall short of a bribe where you go, I get this surface for offering this good, but it doesn't fall much short of it. So I think this is where I disagree with you about the Taylor Swift thing. And also I think the reason why I disagree is that there's a sort of a moral ickiness to it, because there's a lack of consistency in the rules here. And Labour like to go, oh, well, it was all within the rules. Well, the rules are shit, right? The rules are really bad. If you're a civil servant, you have to declare even very, very minor gifts, even like a box of chocolates. On Twitter, someone who used to work in the civil service said that they had to fill in 3 forms to declare a box of chocolates. Anything which was, considered to be too valuable. And Taylor Swift tickets, being very expensive, would fall under that criteria. You're just not allowed to take. Similarly, if you work in the NHS, if it's above a certain level, you have to clear accepting the gift first, with your line management or indeed an independent body if it's big enough. Why is it with a minister of state or the prime minister, it's like, well, as long as you declare it, that's fine. Well, no, it's not fine. It's not fine for everyone else. So why is it fine for you? And I just think that these people are. I've got to say, Michael, I find them beneath contempt. I find them utterly beneath contempt. They're so easily bought for some fucking Taylor Swift tickets. Not even Beyonce.
There is something very infantile about it, right? Because it's just not that hard to say no. If you want to be the deputy prime minister and someone's saying, look, I've got this nice, you're stressed, I've got this nice flat in New York, go stay there, put your feet up. It's not hard to say, that's actually really kind and thank you so much. Like, I would like to do that, but I am an elected politician, so I'm going to have to say no, right? And you've got a high enough income that you can just get an Airbnb in New York, right? The idea that someone dangled this nice shiny thing in front of me and I couldn't possibly say no just doesn't speak particularly well to the sort of character and maturity of the people who are currently in government. And, the people before them. There's nothing exceptional about this, but it is a bit, there's a sort of element of grow up and learn how to say no. Ash, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I get really wound up when I think about the Taylor Swift tickets. I don't know why. It offends my morality.
Well, I just think you hate Bridget Phillipson's innocent children. Not really. You actually made a very persuasive case over the past 10 minutes. So I don't think you've persuaded me really. Thank you everyone for watching tonight. Come back tomorrow for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.